Hello everybody and welcome to our module on zoonotic bacteria. Zoonotic bacteria are bacteria that are transmitted from animals to humans to cause disease. They're all rare, and one thing that I've always found helpful to remember is that almost all of these can be treated with the antibiotic doxycycline. I had an old chief resident who used to call these doxy-sensitive diseases. The hardest part of these infections is recognizing the clinical syndromes. They all have unusual symptoms with unusual exposures for the patient. All these ones over here on the right are transmitted by the bite of a tick or a flea or a louse. You've got to get bit by something to get all these bacteria on the right. These ones on the left you can get directly from exposure to the animal. Some of them do have tick or flea reservoirs as well, but you can get the infection straight from the animal or exposure to the animal. Bartonella henselae is the cause of cat scratch fever, and if you can remember that, it can help you remember that cats harbor fleas that carry the Bartonella bacteria. Cat scratch fever begins with a cat scratch, obviously, and especially in a board question, this is almost always going to be in a child. About 3 to 10 days later, they get a red swollen area where the scratch occurred, and then following that, they will get regional lymphadenopathy. This is the hallmark of the disease. What this means is that they will develop tender regional lymph nodes proximal to the scratch. So for example, most children are scratched in the hand or arm, so they will get tender red lymph nodes usually in the armpit, and that's what cat scratch fever is. Two other conditions that Bartonella can rarely cause are bacillary angiomatosis and endocarditis. So bacillary angiomatosis is a vascular lesion of the skin. These patients get diffuse skin papules, and this only happens in people with HIV/AIDS. And one tricky thing about it is the lesions look very similar to Kaposi sarcoma, which is a tumor that AIDS patients get caused by a virus, and it can be hard to tell the two apart. And then finally, Bartonella is a very rare cause of endocarditis. This is so-called culture-negative endocarditis because this is a difficult bacteria to grow, so patients will have signs and symptoms of endocarditis, but the blood cultures will appear to be sterile. And the treatment for most Bartonella infections, especially cat scratch fever, is doxycycline, as I said, and also erythromycin. Remember that most of these zoonotic infections are covered by doxy. This is a picture of Kaposi sarcomas in a patient who has HIV/AIDS, and these are raised red-purple skin lesions that happen when you have end-stage HIV. They're caused by angioproliferation in people who have infection with a virus called HHV8, and they have a very similar appearance to bacillary angiomatosis caused by Bartonella. Some key differences happen when you do a biopsy and look at the lesions under the microscope. In Kaposi sarcoma, you will see predominantly lymphocytes, and this makes sense because it's a viral infection. In bacillary angiomatosis, you can see neutrophils in addition to lymphocytes, and that also makes sense because it's bacterial. One other special feature of Bartonella infections to know about is that it can cause granuloma formation, and this is a good point to pause and review some of the many infections that can cause the formation of granulomas. So tuberculosis is the prototype, and pretty much everyone knows that tuberculosis causes granuloma formation. And a lot of people know that leprosy does as well because it's caused by a mycobacterium just like tuberculosis. But these other causes I've listed here are some of the sneaky ones, and these are the ones that sometimes catch students on the USMLE exam, so don't let that happen to yourself. So remember that fungal pneumonias can cause granuloma formation. These are infections like histoplasmosis and blastomycosis and coccidiomycosis. One of the reasons they are mimics of tuberculosis is that they cause pneumonia and they can form granulomas. Two of the zoonotic infections in this module can cause granuloma formation. The first is Bartonella, which we just talked about, causes cat scratch disease, and the other one is Brucella, which we'll talk about in a moment. If a baby gets a listeria infection from the mother, they can form granulomas diffusely in their body. This condition is called granulomatosis infantiseptica, and it's got the name granuloma in the title, so that's easy to remember. And these babies will have granulomas all over their bodies. They usually don't survive. Schistosomiasis, which is a helminth or worm infection, can cause granuloma formation. And finally, syphilis can cause granuloma formation. The gummas in syphilis are granulomas that are formed throughout the body. Next zoonotic infection is Brucella. So Brucella comes from cows and goats, and you get it when you consume unpasteurized milk or if you're exposed to the animal. Classic patients are workers in a meat packing plant who may be exposed to cow and goat parts, or travelers from Mexico who consumed milk or cheese that was unpasteurized. Brucellosis is also called undulant fever because it's a flu-like illness with high fevers that rise and fall and cause profuse sweating. And it can be treated with doxycycline just like most of these illnesses. Also streptomycin and rifampin are sometimes used. Chlamydia phyllositosi causes psittacosis, and this is also called parrot fever. And just remember that this P in psittacy stands for parrots, and that'll remind you that this comes from birds. You get infected when you inhale the dried feces of parrots. So the classic patient for this condition is a pet store employee. They get fever and headache, and they get a dry cough. And a way to remember the dry cough is to remember that this has chlamydia in the name, and there is also a chlamydia pneumonia. And the treatment for this is doxycycline. Coxiella burnetii is the cause of Q fever, and this comes from farm animals like cattle, goats, and sheep. It's very unusual among the zoonotic bacteria in that it forms spores that get inhaled, and this can help remind you that it can cause pneumonia. One thing to know is that there are very high concentrations in the placenta of infected animals. So a classic board question is a farm worker who is delivering babies of cattle, sheep, or goats and then gets an illness. The typical illness is pneumonia with flu symptoms. It's also a rare cause of endocarditis. You can diagnose it by sending antibody tests, and it's treated by doxycycline just like the majority of these zoonotic infections. This is a good point at which to pause and review the concept of culture-negative endocarditis. So culture-negative endocarditis means the patient has evidence of endocarditis but sterile blood cultures. So they may have fever and a murmur. They may even have a vegetation on their echocardiogram, but the blood cultures aren't growing anything. Now, in reality, this usually means you made a mistake in obtaining the blood cultures, but on board exams, it means you have an infection with one of these two organisms, Coxiella burnetii, which causes Q fever and comes from farm animals, or Bartonella, which we discussed and causes cat scratch fever and comes from cat fleas. Francisella tularensis causes tularemia, but I prefer to remember it by its other name, rabbit fever, because that helps me remember where it comes from. Important reservoirs for this bacteria are ticks and deer flies, but also rabbits, and it occurs commonly in animal handlers, especially people who have been handling rabbits. In board questions, it's often going to be someone who's been hunting rabbits or handling rabbits. You can also get it from a tick bite. The most common form is called ulceroglandular, and this is such a weird word that I've always remembered it, and I hope you can remember it too, because it reminds you of the two most important symptoms. People who get tularemia get a skin ulcer at the site of an insect bite, and then they get swollen, painful lymph nodes. They also get fevers and chills, which are relatively nonspecific. But if you can just remember rabbits and then this weird word, ulceroglandular, then you can remember pretty much all you need to know to recognize tularemia. And the treatment for this is streptomycin, but doxycycline is okay too. Remember, doxy works for most of these bacteria. Pasteurella lives in the mouth of cats and dogs, and for this bacteria I always picture an angry dog with drool dripping from its sharp teeth, and I think of Pasteurella as being present in that saliva. That helps me remember that it lives in the mouth, and it also helps me remember that you often get infected from bites or scratches from cats or dogs. It can cause a couple of infections. It can cause cellulitis when it bites or scratches the skin. It can also get into the bloodstream and cause osteomyelitis. And one thing to remember is that bite wounds from animals are usually polymicrobial. They contain Staph aureus. They also contain anaerobes. So you generally don't treat them with just an antibiotic for the Pasteurella. You use broad spectrum therapy like amoxicillin clavulanate is an oral option, or amsulbactam or piptazo are IV options. But you always want to use something broad spectrum in anyone who's got an animal bite. Leptospira causes leptospirosis, and I talk about this in more detail in the module on spirochetes. For our purposes here, just know that it lives in rodents and it's shed in the urine. It gets in through scratches in your skin when you swim in contaminated water, so the classic patient is a surfer or swimmer from the tropics, and you can treat it with doxycycline or azithromycin. So that's the last of the zoonotic bacteria that have an animal vector. Now we're going to talk about bacteria that use something like a tick or a flea or a louse in order to carry themselves from the animal to the human. And the first one is Ehrlichia, which causes ehrlichiosis. This is a tick-borne illness because it's carried to humans by the lone star tick. The white-tailed deer is the principal reservoir, and the tick picks it up from the deer and carries it to humans. Ehrlichia is an obligate intracellular bacteria, and it classically causes berry-like inclusions of monocytes called morulae. This is a picture of some morulae down here. There's an arrow pointing at a white blood cell, and you can see a couple small purple inclusions, and those are the morulae of Ehrlichia. The symptoms of Ehrlichia are a flu-like illness, so these are non-specific symptoms like fevers and chills. And then you get leukopenia, and this makes sense because it infects white blood cells, so naturally it will lower the white blood count. It can also lower the platelet count and give you thrombocytopenia. To visualize it, you need to use the Giemsa stain because it's intracellular. Remember, the Giemsa stain is used for lots of intracellular organisms like chlamydia and malaria and others. You can also diagnose it with antibody tests, that's serology. And the treatment is doxycycline, just like most of these zoonotic infections. There is another bacteria called Anaplasma that causes a condition called anaplasmosis, and this is a very similar bacteria to Ehrlichia, except for two important distinctions. The first distinction is the findings you will see on blood smear. The morula in anaplasmosis are seen in the granulocytes, not in the monocytes. And then the second distinction is the tick vector. The tick vector for anaplasma is Ixodes scapularis, not the Lone Star tick. And Ixodes scapularis is a very important tick vector because it's the tick vector for Lyme disease, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also a protozoal blood infection called babesiosis. So they like you to know for your boards all the different infections you can get from Ixodes, and you should know that patients who have Lyme disease may be co-infected with babesiosis or anaplasma. Other than those two distinctions, the symptoms and treatments of anaplasmosis are similar to ehrlichiosis. Patients will get fever and joint pains. They can have low blood cell counts. You can diagnose it by a blood smear, although as I said before, the inclusions are different than in ehrlichiosis. And you can also treat anaplasma with doxycycline, just like you can for Ehrlichia. Borrelia burgdorferi is a zoonotic infection. This is the cause of Lyme disease. This is a spirochete, and I talk about it in more detail in the module on spirochetes. It's caused by a tick bite of Ixodes scapularis, as I just said. The tick larvae feed on mice, which are the reservoir, and then the adult ticks feed on deer. So it's called a deer tick, but actually the reservoir is not deer, it's mice. The ticks bite humans and cause Lyme disease. It's common in the Northeast. It's named after Lyme, Connecticut, which is in the Northeast of the United States. So in a board question, it'll be a patient who's from New York or Connecticut or Massachusetts, and it's treated with doxycycline or ceftriaxone. Next, we're going to talk about rickettsia, but first let me talk about rickettsia and chlamydia because they are very similar types of bacteria. They're both obligate intracellular bacteria that use the host ATP for energy. Chlamydia cannot make ATP at all, and rickettsia can only make a little bit. Neither of them can be cultured on common media. You have to inoculate them into living cells like the yolk sac of chicken embryos in order to grow them. They're both very small with a size that's close to viruses. And then chlamydia, as you may know, is transmitted person to person. Often it's sexually transmitted. And rickettsia is transmitted by either a tick or an insect. So there are three different rickettsia infections you need to know about. They all come from the bites of ticks or fleas or lice. And the three subtypes are rickettsia, which causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, rickettsia typhi, which causes murine typhus, and rickettsia prowazekii, which causes epidemic typhus. Before we go any further, let me explain the difference between typhus and typhoid because the words sound alike but they mean different things. Typhus is a Greek word for smoky or hazy, and it was used by Hippocrates to describe a state of mind in people who were infected. Typhus is caused by rickettsia species, and it can occur in plagues caused by rickettsia prowazekii. Typhoid has to do with typhoid fever. This is caused by Salmonella typhi. It's a GI illness with diarrhea and also fever and rose spots, and I talk about this in the module on gram-negative rods. Let's talk about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is caused by rickettsia. This occurs throughout the U.S. despite the name, and it's transmitted by a tick bite, but a third of people don't recall or notice the tick bite. So just because someone denies a history of being bitten by a tick doesn't mean they can't have Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The classic triad is a headache, a fever, and a rash, and this is not very helpful because a headache and fever are common to many things. The way you're going to recognize this is by noticing that someone's got a possible tick exposure and then has a characteristic rash. Now the headache and fever often come first, but then it gets the classic rash, which is a maculopapular rash that starts at the wrists and ankles and then spreads to the trunk, and very importantly, it involves the palms and soles. There are only three rashes that involve the palms and soles. One is syphilis, the other is Coxsackie virus, and the third is this one. So when you see a rash that is on the palms and soles, and it's someone who's been out in the mountains where they could have been bitten by a tick, you should think of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It can rarely progress from the rash and fever to cause severe complications like encephalitis and seizures and disseminated intravascular coagulation, and the treatment is doxycycline, just like most of these zoonoses. Murine typhus is caused by Rickettsia typhi. This is also called endemic typhus because it's endemic to certain parts of the world and certain populations, and it doesn't cause epidemic outbreaks. Its reservoir is the rat, and that's easy to remember because the word murine means related to mice or rats. It's transmitted from rat fleas to humans, and it's common in developing parts of the world. People get a flu-like illness, and then they get a maculopapular rash that starts in the trunk and spreads outward, and the treatment of this is doxycycline. Epidemic typhus is caused by Rickettsia prowazekii, and this is mostly historical. It's very rare in the modern era, but epidemics throughout history have killed millions of people. There have been some outbreaks reported in Africa during civil wars. It's transmitted by the body louse, so you have to have really dirty, unclean conditions for this to thrive. The body louse lives on skin and clothes, and then it lays eggs that hatch, and the larvae suck blood, and this is kind of nasty, but during a meal the louse defecates highly infective feces, and the rickettsia in the louse feces get through the skin and membrane. So obviously these have to be really unsanitary conditions for this to spread, but that's present during some civil wars in Africa, and it's been present throughout history, and epidemics of this have broken out. Just like all the Rickettsia infections, it has nonspecific symptoms like fevers, chills, headaches, and malaise. And just like all Rickettsia species, it has a maculopapular rash. In this case, it starts in the trunk and spreads out. And it can progress to confusion and seizures and coma, and you can treat it with doxycycline just like most of these infections. The last zoonotic bacteria we'll talk about is Yersinia pestis, which is the cause of the bubonic plague. The reservoir for this bacteria is the rats, although it's also sometimes found in squirrels or prairie dogs. Humans usually get disease from a flea bite of a rat, although it can also be spread by respiratory droplets if a lot of people are infected. There are nonspecific symptoms like fevers, chills, and headaches, and then the hallmark is intense pain or swelling of a lymph node. This is called a bubo. So buboes have exquisite tenderness, there's erythema and swelling of the skin overlying them, and the inguinal region is the most common place. In fact, the word bubo is a Greek word for groin, and this is usually treated with streptomycin, although doxycycline also works. And that concludes our module on zoonotic infections.